Hello.
Hello.
That's right. It is YouTube time this time all the time.
If you like poetry, if you like literature, if you like cultural history, then you've come to the right place. We make podcasts about all of those things. So be sure to like and share this video. And of course, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload.
Since we mostly make podcasts, you can also find our shows on all the major podcast platforms. So if you found this video, but YouTube isn't your speed for regular podcast listening, head over to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe there.
All right. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello, and welcome to this all new episode of Close Talking. I am your co host, Jack Rossiter Mumley.
And I am your co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And this is the podcast where we read a poem, talk about a poem, and then read the poem again. Today, our poem is Armor by Sharon Olds. And quickly, before we get into our discussion of that, our bi-monthly polite request. We have at times called it a plea, but that seems a little bit dramatic. So,
Yeah.
kind entreaty to leave us an old rating and review over on the iTunes store, also known as Apple Podcasts, because those ratings and reviews, number one, warm our hearts, and number two, help the podcast get lifted up that old algorithm, and it helps us find new listeners. So if you've got a second and you have a couple of kind words to spare for this old hunk of cold poetry podcast, we sure do appreciate it.
We do indeed.
So today we are talking about Armor by Sharon Olds, an excellent poem by a truly exceptional poet. Sharon Olds is probably one of the bigger names in contemporary American poetry. She was the Poet Laureate of New York from 1998 to 2000. She has gotten fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the NEA. She's a professor at NYU, and perhaps I could be accused of burying the lead here, winner of the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for her book Stag's Leap, which is about divorce.
Yeah, no, and her one of her early books, which I think the poem Armor was published in, The Dead and the Living, is like remains one of the best-selling poetry collections like in the US, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, and she kind of it's interesting. She has she writes a lot about like I don't know. It's like personal, often domestic like issues, and often like she's like often women's sexuality is like a very big part about her a subject of her poems, to a degree that the critic Helen Wendler, who's like one of the preeminent, she's like the Harold Bloom of poetry, if you could say so,
The
both in
most
probably
dubious of distinctions.
yeah, good and bad. But she calls Sharon Olds poetry pornographic, which is crazy because I mean that's just an absurd thing. But I think it's interesting because now she's also one of those poets. I think she's like 77, where I think in a large part because of her work that was like pretty. No one was writing like things, about the topics that she was writing about at the time, and it was like pretty bold, and like I think like risky work or whatever. Now feels like it's not as her poems are no less powerful, but it's not sort of like I think as taboo as it might have been, when she was like first publishing, which was I think like, the early late seven. I think her first book came out in 1980 maybe. Um, and so yeah, but I think that it's not as taboo in part because of the like the incredible quality of her poems, but also the fact that she kind of forged ahead unflinchingly, writing about these topics, and like now she's canon, so it's like, you know, all the younger generations of poets like kind of have permission, where, you know, like she had to make the permission for herself in a kind of way.
And as you noted, there was clearly a huge audience for the type of work that she was doing, so it kind of added on to the fact that there wasn't a voice like hers out there, in that there was also a hunger for that voice.
Yeah.
And as you so rightly noted, her influence is evident in just the landscape of poetry that has come since.
Yeah, it actually reminds me, and then we should get into the poem, but I just saw, and I think you did as well, the great movie Little Women, which I'm currently obsessed with. And there's that line, because Louisa May Alcott was in her own day kind of like a version of Sharon Olds of you know, writing, you know, about women and about issues that were, you know, traditionally not thought to be the stuff of novels or whatever. But there's the line in the movie that's like, I think it's between Amy and Joe, and it's like, Joe's like, you know, art reflects like what's important, and then Amy's like, I think art can confer what's important, basically, like it can. And writing about the domestic or writing about women is a way of making those issues like important, you know, not just like holding up a mirror to the world, but being like, this is the mirror that you should be looking at, kind of thing.
Absolutely.
So shout out Little Women. I love
Little
it.
Women.
So good.
Fantastic. So without further ado, on to Armor by Sharon Olds. Just about at the triple-barreled pistol, I can't go on. I sink down as if shot, beside the ball of its butt, loaded with mother of pearl. My son leaves me on the bench and goes on. Hand on hip, he gazes at a suit of armor, blue eyes running over the silver, looking for a slit. He shakes his head, hair greenish as the gold velvet cod-shirt hanging before him in volutes at the metal groin. Next, I see him facing a case of shields, fingering the sweater over his heart, and then for a long time I don't see him, as a mother will lose her son in war. I sit and think about men. Finally, Gabriel comes back, sated, so fattened with gore his eyelids bulge. We exit, under the huge, tumescent jousting irons, their pennants a faded rose, like the mist before his eyes. He slips his hand lightly in mine, and says, not one of those suits is really safe. But when we get to the wide museum steps railed with gold like the descent from heaven, he can't resist. And before my eyes, down the stairs, over and over, clutching his delicate, unprotected chest, Gabriel dies and dies.
Whew.
I'm
So
really
good.
into this poem, mainly because I like how it is a very kind of straightforward and easy to grasp scene that she goes so many places with, because in a little break from our last few episodes that have been a little bit more out there, we can actually, I think, do a little bit of a play-by-play in this poem. The basic narrative is like a mother and her son visit the armor exhibit at the museum.
Yep. And the mother speaker doesn't like it, and the son does. I mean, that's also the...
In the simplest terms, I think that is, yeah, that's the overview. Like, mother and son visit armor exhibit, have different experiences.
Yep, pretty much.
But I like the kind of subtle ways that she teases out the different layers of complexity of what's going on for her during that visit, because I feel like there's also a lot of attention paid to what is going on for the son as well. And I think that there's a version of this poem that just focuses a lot more solely on the mother's experience. And yes, it would be reflecting on what her son is doing, but I like the amount of attention that's paid to giving us a hint at what she thinks he's thinking about, and how caught up she is not only in her own reflection, but in like trying to penetrate and think about what he is getting from this experience.
Yeah, I think that's really right. Yeah, this poem is so good because it is there's so many dynamics to the mother-son relationship that are kind of being got at, like on the most kind of basic like level, like a theme that's being explored is just kind of like masculinity and like the way that like boys are raised to glorify violence and see this like, you know, the suits of armor, the guns, all this stuff as like cool shit. And that like that's, you know, kind of like the height of, you know, being a man or whatever. And it's kind of like on, you know, one level is like the speaker, the mother is like watching, you know, her son basically be buying into that like before her eyes, basically. And being, yeah, and just having a lot of feelings about it, which is really interesting.
That idea about sort of witnessing her child taking on, I guess, social ideas of masculinity and its relationship to violence, or just the way that masculinity is performed, is something that she explores in a couple of her other poems as well. One of the really famous ones is Rite of Passage, which is this scene at her son's like 7th birthday party where he and the other boys are sort of talking about who they can and can't beat up. And so that's sort of a theme that runs through it, but I think this is a little bit more of like a pointed examining of that topic.
Yeah, no, I really think you're right. And it's it's the way that it, you know, like, what you were saying about like the straightforward scene, like I feel like that's so important to this poem and does so much work because basically like, you know, you can think of this poem as like, it's like point A to point B to point C to point D, and each like thing is like another object that the son is like looking at, and then like as he sort of approaches each thing, there's like a new like dimension or layer that the mother like either feels or witnesses or something like that. So like in the very beginning, it's like you get the pistol and she's like, all right, I'm out. Like this stuff is not for me, you know, like I don't find it interesting and like it's brutal and whatever. And then, you know, like, you know, the sun goes on and then is like gazing at the suit of armor, like blue eyes running over the silver. So there we don't quite, we're not quite like to the sort of thematic core, but we're like, the son's interested in it, the mother is not. And then it's like he shakes his head, hair greenish as the gold velvet cod-shirt hanging before him in volutes at the metal groin. It's so colorful and like descriptive, which I think gets at like, I think what you're saying about like the war games and how it's, you know, like they're not just weapons, like they're the ornaments and like the kind of performative like accessories to war and to violence. And like there you get this sense of like his hair is like the gold velvet cod shirt. And then, you know, there's like, you know, the metal groin, and, you know, you start to get the image of, you know, just that this is a boy thing. I don't know. Like the fact that it's the groin, just, it's like like once, because eventually you get to the the tumescent jousting things, which is so hilarious and amazing. And like tumescent is like a word that I had to look up, but of course it just means like swollen, because basically you're aroused, and so it's just like these giant phallic jousting whatevers. But the use of the word tumescent is like so funny because it's just like such a beautiful sounding word. And I feel like you start at the groin and then you get to the tumescent. Um, so anyway, and then like he's like fingering the sweater over his heart as he's like facing the shields. It's like she's watching him, basically become like sort of like aroused by um, the armor and the displays.
Definitely. The huge tumescent, also great sounds.
Yeah.
And I love the idea of a couple of knights like jousting at each other with giant like penis jousts. I mean, there is penis fencing in the animal kingdom. There's some animals that engage in what is referred to by scientists, those dirty birds, as penis fencing, which is quite literally what they're doing. But you're right.
Wow.
There is sort of this like phallic through line of various stuff. I mean, it starts with a gun, which is, it looks kind of like a penis. It like explodes stuff out of it, There's a lot of phallic symbolism in weaponry, swords and whatnot. And then also in terms of what is the weakness in all of these, it's like a chink in your armor, or is this poem terms it a slit, which I think has obvious, female genital connotations here. But there's also running through it this sense of excess, which you were also sort of getting at. There's these huge tumescent jousting irons. He's fattened with gore. His eyelids are bulging. The initial item that sets this whole poem in motion, it's a gun, but it's a triple-barreled pistol. Like, how many barrels do you need? It's like these implements that are the vast excess of, potential violence. And you can understand why they would elicit these two reactions, that there could be this kind of intense fascination or this revulsion. And not that war or weightlifting competitions have to be gendered, but in terms of how it operates in this poem, I feel like there is a similar drive to a weird excess that she is identifying as, at least culturally, something that her son has been primed to accept in a particular way. And what I think is really interesting is that in addition to cataloging how that's happening to him, she also then gets into how he is even recognizing the inherent dangers and threat that lies in it. Because when she describes him looking at the shields and fingering the sweater over his heart, it's almost like he's thinking about, how do I protect my heart? Like, what is my own vulnerability here? Sweaters are soft. The heart isn't easily punctured, part of the body. But then even later on, when the one time we hear him speak and he says, not one of those suits is really safe. Like, he knows that there's no sure protection from the world of violence, but also is then like immediately drawn into acting out his own death.
Yeah.
So I think that is like a really interesting component of the poem, that he's not coming out of this exhibit saying like, I can't wait to be a knight in shining armor, or I'm so excited to like sword fight with Devon later. He's recognizing that there's no way to be 100% protected. And I'm sort of curious what your thoughts are about that realization coming towards the end and then being followed by him like doing a clutch and fall death down the museum stairs.
Yeah. No, I love all of that. It's really interesting because it's like, it's also possible he just like, because, it's like he slips his hand lightly in mine and says, not one of those suits is really safe. It's almost like there's also a way to read it where like he gets it, but like what he really is perceiving is like that his mom is like, this fucking thing is stupid and I'm stressed about it, and he's like placating, like, oh, like, I know it's all silly, but then it's like clearly he's so wrapped up in it that he immediately is like doing that thing where you're just like, oh, ah, I am slain, you know, in the Shakespearean sense. And like, I don't know, which I certainly have done, and it's sort of like enjoyable to have that dramatic, like, oh, like you're crumpling to the ground and you're clutching your heart. And
I definitely have the home videos to prove that I did that as a child.
yeah, which is interesting because it's also, you know, you're bringing up like the protection, because like there are mentions of, you know, the weapons like the pistol and the jousting iron, but like the title, you know, is armor, and a lot of it is about the shields, and this end is like, you know, clutching his delicate unprotected chest, Gabriel dies and dies. And what he's acting out is like not like killing someone, although of course that is like certainly part of the kind of masculinity that is sort of being interrogated here. But it's like the dying part that is also the glorious or like fun thing. And which yeah, I don't know, it's interesting. And it's also like the other parts that are interesting are these like two moments that are like pretty intense, like that are these like similes that happens. One is at the beginning and the other is at the middle, where just about at the triple-barreled pistol, I can't go on. That's how it starts. I sink down, line break as if shot, you know, beside the ball of its butt loaded with mother of pearl. So she's like, you know, she's like, the simile is like, I've just been shot because I'm so disturbed I'm so hurt by like seeing the pistol, and it's offensive to me to the degree of like, you know, being shot with an actual bullet. And then there's this other moment where like she's sort of watching him go from thing to thing, and then he like disappears for a while, like, you know, down the hall or whatever. And then it's like, and then for a long time I don't see him, as a mother will, and then there's another line break, lose her son in war, which is like another very not like off topic simile, but like a quite extreme, you know, worry and like image to give, like, to, you know, to compare watching your son go, like losing sight of your son down the hall of a museum being equivalent, like making that equivalent to losing, you know, your son in war, which like I think are, you know, deliberately, of course, you know, it's a simile, obviously, like the poet and the speaker understand that she's not actually saying that that is as bad as the other, but there's these interesting parts where the imagination, like it's the other part, and especially how it ends with her son, you know, reenacting his death, is like, and I'm curious what you think of this, is like, it's not just that she's like, oh, my son has like, you know, sort of absorbed and is interested and is performing this kind of masculinity that I find problematic and disturbing, but also because of that, like he's now vulnerable in a way that he wasn't before, like because he like has that you know, like that sense of himself, like that makes him like, you know, maybe more prone to like later on in life, in the extreme case, actually enter the military or something like that. But and then also it's just interesting too, where I feel like there's such a, and this is like, it just feels, because the way that it ends is so poignant and like clutching his delicate, unprotected chest, Gabriel dies and dies. And like, of course, on one level, it's just her watching her son do this thing, but it's also like it feels like it's a part of her son that has died, where like she's like suddenly distant from her son in a way that she hasn't been before, I guess, which I like imagine, especially like, you know, for a lot of mothers, who like haven't like been necessarily socialized, like obviously in this masculine way, whereas fathers may be like, right at you, like, go get him, like make sure if he punches you, punch him back twice or something. Obviously that's not good parental advice, but there's certainly that trope of the dad like reinforcing and being, maybe the prime socializer of the son, to like be this kind of to think of being a man in this way, that like when a father would see this perhaps, or that kind of father, it wouldn't be this moment of like, it would be a moment of familiarity, like, but now there's this kind of like, now my son is like not just a kid, like he's like a young man or like a boy, and is like, and that's like, I can just imagine, it feels like in this poem is like a real loss for the mother, because she can no longer relate to him in a particular way. I don't know. I wasn't sure about that reading, but
I really like that reading, and I think it's spot on, because you see a lot of moments here where that's happening, and particularly at that end. Which, yeah, I want to come back to that in a second, but what you were saying about vulnerability really struck me, because it's both about him being personally vulnerable because he might buy into these myths, but also in some ways her recognizing that despite however she is socializing him or acculturating him, he is still vulnerable to them. So it's like there's a lot going on there. But that end of the poem, I really like thinking about it in that sense of like the sun transitioning in her eyes almost from one stage of life to the next through this experience and their divergent experiences of it. Because there's a lot of imagery in there that is almost reminiscent of what would be like a fall from an innocent garden, like reaching back biblically, because the name Gabriel, which, that's just sort of in the poem because it's the son's name, but you have this image of the wide museum steps with this little child falling down them. So right there you have the sense of this big sweep, which she says, like the descent from heaven. So you already have a sense of like a fall from heaven, and Gabriel being an angel name, you have like a fallen angel going from this one state of being and through this transformation, dying and dying down the stairs into this sort of fallen state. Even though the word fall is not used.
But descent, yeah.
But descent, yeah. And I think the image that's conjured is of this little body sort of tumbling down these giant gilded stairs. And I definitely see some of that going on there, for sure. And as I had mentioned earlier, there's in the other poem that I know of that's really tightly tied into these themes, Rite of Passage, it's a very similar kind of watching her son, in that instance, amongst other boys his age, and she's sort of imagining the men they're all going to become, and they're all going to be these bankers who stand around, and even in that moment at the birthday party, they're like, a 7-year-old says that he could beat up a 6-year-old, and they kind of argue about whether that would happen. And then her son says, well, we could all kill a 2-year-old. And it's like this weird, like very like 100% buy it little kid conversation. It's just like
Yeah.
stupid, inane,
Yeah.
kind of like Batman could never beat up Superman because he doesn't have any real superpowers. He just has like a utility belt. Uh, yeah, well, what if he had a kryptonite utility belt? Maybe we should spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a movie about this. I don't know. Whatever. But it's a similar kind of like, here it's observing her son in conversation with a social idea on a grand scale of like adult masculinity or what it means to be a man, and there it's this more particular like socialization amongst peers kind of masculinity. But I do think you see that transition because even though it's not stated explicitly, we see them enter the poem together and leave it separately. And they separate almost instantly because as soon as I can't go on, I sink down, we suddenly realize that like they walked into this gallery together, she sat down, he kept going. And so even though it doesn't say we walked into the gallery together and then just about at the triple-barreled pistol, like we don't need that, it's implied. But the fact that we can see her sort of standing at the top of the stairs watching him fall away from her at the end, I think really does, on just like an image level, align with the reading that you posited. And you're right, this could, with like a traditional male figure, you would imagine, or like a traditional father relationship, this might be this moment of sort of like bonding or recognition, whereas it is not in this case.
Yeah. No, I think that's really right. And I think we're like, one part that I also really love is a part that I think starts to clue, basically is the big cluing us in to that theme of the poem, which also is like a great, I feel like, moment of poetic craft because it's kind of like a turn where this moment at right after he leaves, and then it's like, as a mother will lose her son in war, I sit and think about men, which that moment is so amazing for so many reasons because it's like so simple. It's probably the shortest sentence in the poem. It's not even like when you get to the point where in a poem you can say those simple things and you've basically charged the words because of like what's come before, so that you only need to be like, I sit and think about men, and it's like, oh man, like that's what it's about. But like to your point of, how you're describing like the excesses of, like the armor and the things in the museum, is not just, it's not just like, as you're saying, the things themselves are excessive, but also the language of the poem is flowery, like it's extravagant. You have greenish as the gold velvet cod-shirt hanging before him in volutes at the metal groin. Like there's a lot of and then later, you have like railed with gold, like the descent from heaven. There's this big language, and this moment is like, I sit and think about men. The language is very paired and not embellished and plain. And I feel like it's also the moment where narratively is the kind of turn where he leaves and it's like, what will he come back as? And it's like, he comes back sated. He's like become like the man boy, like that that he's been like absorbing through this armor stuff. And I feel like it's such a subtle, great move where it's like this short, plain sentence that also carries the big thematic weight that then, like, because we're used to this pattern both of sentence length and language sort of texture, we're kind of ready, like, in all of these different ways to like head towards the end of the poem because of like how all of that shifts like in that moment.
That's so true. And it does sit basically smack dab in the middle of the poem. And you're so right. The way that the poem builds, it almost has the function of turning the M in men into like a capital M. Because it makes it such a big statement that it just becomes about the concept of manhood almost. Or
Yeah.
like the social idea of stereotypical manhood and what men are like supposed to do.
Yeah.
It does that so effectively. And you're right, because it is right before he comes back, and it also, as you were noting, like it almost has that like hero's journey into the wilderness and return feel to it, where like he's gone out into the wild and he's encountered all of these strange and wonderful things, and she's sort of observing him doing it and how he's doing it, and then he comes back changed.
Yeah, and then it ends like I feel like there's like one more slight turn toward the end of the poem, which is like the move to like the last moment, which is like the when we which narratively there's the turn because it's like the last action. So it's like when we get to the museum steps, railed with gold like the descent from heaven, he can't resist. And then it's like, and before my eyes, down the stairs, over and over, clutching his delicate, unprotected chest, Gabriel dies and dies. And this is just so well done in so many ways because I was actually reading this interview with Sharon Olds in the I think the Washington Square Review, and it was funny because she was basically talking about how she like didn't realize it at the time, but basically she loves writing in like 4-beat lines with like a lot of sort of internal half rhyme, but like these 4-beat lines with like tons of enjambment basically. And that and then I was like reading this poem again and I was like, oh, that's like so right, because there's so many of these lines are in this kind of 4 stress and this kind of heavy enjambment. It's like,
I was going to ask about the heavy enjambment because I feel like that's something that's almost its own subject within this poem, because there's so much going on in it on like a conceptual level and an idea level, but on a craft level, the enjambment is wild in this poem.
Yeah, it is really wild. I mean, so there's like, so in the beginning, we have just about at the triple-barreled pistol, which is like a pretty, I don't know if you would call it 4 stress, but it's like almost 4 stress. It's like just about at the triple-barreled pistol, which kind of gets you to the 4. I can't go on. I sink down. So that's like a short 4, which is kind of cool. As if shot. And that enjambment is amazing. And then beside the ball of its butt. So there's like the stresses. There's a lot of, it's not like it's not what you would call like iambic tetrameter or something, where like you have like 8 syllables. It's like where 4 of them are stressed. It's just like 4 stresses generally, and then there's a lot of kind of smaller syllables. So it's like, as if shot, and the as if is like the unstressed kind of parts, but then it's like beside the ball of its butt, and the of its, kind of thing. And then, yeah, there's just a lot of these moments, but then you're right, like hand on hip is another one, like before him in volumes at the metal groin, fingering the sweater over his heart, as a mother will lose her son in war, I sit and think about men. Like we exit under the huge tumescent jousting irons, which is amazing. And it's interesting because sometimes that enjambment confused me for a moment because I was like, okay, it ends on the, which is not always like some of the enjambments are like, okay, fingering, like that's a pretty evocative, provocative, word, and you put it at the end of the line, so you're like, okay, what's he fingering? It's kind of weird. And then it's like you get the information at the end, but then so to end with it's like, okay, but then you're like, then you get to huge tumescent jousting irons, which it's like, of course you want all four of those words to have its own line. One thing that Sharon Olds is so good at is like her rhythms and her forms and her lines and her sentences like are so smooth, and like all of these little modulations and shifts and turns and things that are happening are not loud changes, and like you wouldn't like it wasn't until I read in an interview that she was like, I really like four stress lines, and then I was like, oh, let me go look specifically at this poem for four stress lines.
Definitely. I feel you on how quiet it is, because it also is like very readable. Like it's easy to read aloud. You don't feel the enjambments in a sort of herky-jerky, throwing you out kind of way, but they do come at these really interesting, cool moments. I sit, line break, and think about men. It gives you a little bit of time to almost sit with her and wonder where she's going to go in this moment, because as you were saying earlier, that's a place in the poem where a lot has been built up. There's a lot of things she could be sitting there doing or thinking about. Because it also comes right after she says that she, loses him for a minute, as a mother will lose her son in war. I sit. Is she about to like frantically try and find him? I, on first reading, wasn't sure if this was like, oh, is this the story of like the time I lost my son at the museum and then had to find, like I feel like there's a little room for something like that, but no, it's like everything's fine because it's not actually like war. Everything's perfectly safe. She knows that he's in this gallery. It's not like he's really lost. He's just lost from sight temporarily, and she's thinking about men. And I like the way that those bigger enjambments hit, but don't feel like oppressive.
I mean, I guess it's just obviously masculinity has been fucked up for so long, but it's funny knowing that I think it was like, so it came out in the book that was in 84, so it must have been before that, but it's like I grew up and we grew up like when the violent video games were like the whole thing, and everyone was like saying things to this effect about video games, and it was just interesting to see like a poem from before that time basically saying it's just like an evergreen aspect of life that has different textures, but like is and obviously like in the choice of the being in a museum and focusing on this armor, it extends the kind of comment and the kind of thought to a much greater span of history, because it's like these aren't like sniper rifles from like World War II or whatever.
No, I think that spread of history is really important because it's both reaching back to the Middle Ages has a very particular gendered context to it, because it is like damsels in distress and knights in shining armor is like the go-to princesses and heroes tropes that are thrown around a lot, and particularly the way that was portrayed in media for a very long time, particularly in the same era that produced a lot of the classic westerns that were more so than these films like fundamental to shaping 20th century American masculinity. But you also have all these like knight in shining armor tales and the umpteenth retellings of Robin Hood stories, which I know were a big deal for me when I was a kid, but like they also reinforce very particular ideas about gender and violence. And I think that on one level it is presenting all of that and sort of showing the ways that this has always operated, but it also functions as this really neat reframing of how you could look at or think about violence, which is a whole other aspect, because along with the way that society often has portrayed, either through art or through, news presentations or whatever, like the way that war is talked about and thought about is often from the perspective of the people fighting in it, and that's often men. So it's the way that it's talked about, and not just the violence itself. And that's what I think is really interesting about this poem, because so much of what this poem is about the potential for violence and the effects of violence. It's not about violence itself. And so much of the way that war is portrayed, particularly in cinema, but even in literature, is it's about the sort of being in the violent space itself. And some of the very best reframings of war are not looking at the fighters, but looking at the impacts on civilian populations, which are usually women and children. There was a really good PBS series called Women, War, and Peace, and there was a second series of it that was just done recently. The first one came out, I think, in 2011, but it was sort of based on this premise of looking at conflicts through the impacts they had, not on the people fighting in them, because if you go to find a documentary about World War I or World War II or the Gulf War or Vietnam or any of these other conflicts, you're going to find a documentary that tells you the story of like the battle strategies and the generals and the soldiers, but it's also about all of the displaced people and all of the sexual violence that accompanies wars and all this other sort of stuff that is in many ways just as big a story, but it's the one that goes untold. And the same way that when you go to an exhibit in a museum of suits of armor, the story that is often not being told there is that just the existence of that exhibit is this particular kind of fetishization of these various objects, as you were saying, conferring power on them as art, but also admiring the beauty of them as a spectator has a certain, there are implications to doing that are easy to overlook. And I think that that's something that this poem does really effectively, is provide that alternative framing to that experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Because I was just thinking, like, the other thing this poem does so well is, like, connect the two, be a connective tissue, like, where oftentimes, as you were saying, like, these narratives of male violence are so, want to think of themselves, like, by itself, like, just I gotta do, like, and this is like, no, they're in a world and it's filled with other people and it's filled with women and mothers and who are like often bearing incredible burdens and pains, like as men are doing their dumb shit, basically, that often go sort of, like, at least in the kind of mainstream discourse and like things like that go sort of unheard. And this kind of really, in a poignant way, like, sort of makes that connection. Should we read it again?
Let's do it. Armor by Sharon Olds. Just about at the triple-barreled pistol, I can't go on. I sink down as if shot, beside the ball of its butt, loaded with mother of pearl. My son leaves me on the bench and goes on. Hand on hip, he gazes at a suit of armor, blue eyes running over the silver, looking for a slit. He shakes his head, hair greenish as the gold velvet cod-shirt hanging before him in volutes at the metal groin. Next, I see him facing a case of shields, fingering the sweater over his heart, and then for a long time, I don't see him, as a mother will lose her son in war. I sit and think about men. Finally, Gabriel comes back, sated, so fattened with gore his eyelids bulge. We exit under the huge tumescent jousting irons, their pennants a faded rose like the mist before his eyes. He slips his hand lightly in mine and says, "Not one of those suits is really safe." But when we get to the wide museum steps, railed with gold like the descent from heaven, he can't resist. And before my eyes, down the stairs, over and over, clutching his delicate, unprotected chest, Gabriel dies and dies.
Hey, thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. Those reviews help us with the algorithm and are the best way for us to find new listeners.
Do you have thoughts about this poem? Or is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? We would love to hear from you, and there are tons of ways to get in touch.
Yes, you can send us an email to closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. I'm at Jack Rossiter Munn, Connor is at Connor M. Stratton, and the show is at Close Talking.
On Instagram, we are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/closetalking.
And speaking of all of those many and varied social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena.
Woo woo!
Woo!
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Come back again.
Please come back just one more time.
Door's always open. Okay, bye.
See ya.